looking for those who are on YouTube. Facebook, welcome back. I know you missed us. This is, and I still have Laurel's wonderful caption, this is the 99 Pages Educator Book Club. We read and discuss 99 pages every week. We are discussing Elena Aguilar's book called Onward. It's about cultivating emotional resilience, which is something that we so desperately need in today's fraught times. The tenet of 99 pages is we just read 99 pages every week. We try to make it doable. So while this seems like a big, scary textbook, we are chunking it. And so today we're going to be talking about concepts in the first 4 chapters. Those include know yourself. She structures it based on the calendar school year. So know yourself and the importance of purposefulness, understanding emotions, and she talks about acceptance, tell empowering stories, which centers on optimism as the key disposition, and lastly, building community, which focuses on empathy as the key disposition. So we're going to tackle each of those chapters one by one, but I am going to ask our panelists to reintroduce themselves, if that's okay. They have previously shared a technique that they've used for their own self-soothing during these stressful times. But now I'd love for each of you to share a little bit more about what your work is and what brings you here today, why you're interested in social emotional coaching as it applies to your current work. So with that, I'd love for to start, we'll just go clockwise. Rudy, if you don't mind, tell us a little bit more about your work and yourself.
Thanks so much, Jackie. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and part of the discussion. In my 20th year serving public education. My first 8 years in education were as a high school math and computer science teacher in my hometown of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in Milwaukee Public Schools. I had a wonderful experience working with young adults, and really just excited about the opportunity to make a difference through education. I kind of got pulled into school leadership and served as an assistant principal at a middle high school for a couple of years, and then got recruited into district leadership. And so first in Milwaukee and then later for Baltimore City Public Schools, oversaw the college and career readiness efforts, and have had the opportunity over the last few years to kind of broaden my scope and serve initially all of Maryland as Chief Education Officer for the Maryland Business Roundtable for Education, a nonprofit, and more recently in the last couple of years working around the country as a partner with 4 Point Education Partners to improve educational equity with communities around the country. So really excited to be here. The topic and the book really resonate with me personally and professionally as I complete my doctorate at Johns Hopkins University and looking at ways that we can better support especially new teachers. And so a lot of what is discussed in the book resonates with what I've been learning, researching, and writing lately.
Thank you, Rudy. I know personally you've been doing an extensive lit review, so please distill your learnings for all of us who are not in doctorate programs. And congrats to you on demonstrating lifelong learning, and very excited to call you Dr. Ruiz. Next up, my co-founder, excited to introduce Paula Hernandez. And you're on mute, Paula.
See, I need to remember. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Super excited to be here. I'm from Colombia. I've lived in Colombia the majority of my life. I started my journey in education as a contemporary dance teacher, teaching kids that were displaced by violence in Colombia. And I saw the impact that the arts and education can do, and decided to continue in that journey. I became an education consultant, and I worked in different places in Latin America, then moved to India to understand a different context, and now I'm here in the US. I've been working mostly with adult learners, just trying to see how you can connect them to better jobs. This year, because of the pandemic, I had the opportunity to work with the school districts, principals, teachers, students, and parents, trying to understand how do we make the situation better for everyone in K-12 education. And the key takeaway and the reason why I'm here and I'm co-founding Edwell with Jackie is because the pandemic has been hard for everyone, but in particular for our teachers and educators. Overall, all the difficulties of being a teacher and being a caregiver have just been magnified with times and with the conditions that we are in right now. So that brings me today to this panel, and Elena Aguilar has been an amazing resource for Jackie and I as we think of avenues to support teachers today.
Thank you so much, Paula. I am learning so much working alongside you. I have also learned a ton over the past decade, getting to know a dear friend and fellow Baltimore TFA colleague, Kendra Gray. Snaps for Kendra.
Thank you, Jackie. Hi, everyone. As Jackie stated, yes, I am working out of Baltimore City. I'm a Blueprint Literacy Coach for Baltimore City Public Schools, where I support students and teachers at school number 15, Stadium School. And what really motivates and inspires me to take part in this experience is just the want to be a better coach. I'm always striving for personal development and improvement, professional development and improvement. And so this opportunity is a great way to join and convene with colleagues to be able to talk about ways that I can apply these learnings to my own professional practice. And so, yeah, I'm hoping to see the return on my investment by being able to channel some of these ideas through my teachers, and also by supporting the new initiative of Edwell. So really excited to be a part of that as well as a founding coach.
We are the ones who are lucky to have you on board, Kendra. So thank you. Another person who has trouble saying no to me is a childhood friend who has been with me through the emotional highs and lows since we were 10 years old. My friend, Zachariah Sherbini.
Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here with you tonight. It feels like I just blinked, and then all of a sudden I had a decade under my belt in education. So I've taught in pre-K, kindergarten, and third grade, and I've also been a vice principal at the elementary school level for 4 years. This year I'm taking the year off, partly due to just the COVID landscape, and also partly to take a step back and decide sort of where my next steps in education will be. Immediately, they are working as a founding coach with Edwell, which is one of the inspirations for reading this book, Onward by Elena Aguilar. But I also remember the first time I came across her writing. It was during a graduate school program a little more than a year ago, and we were just drowning in a bunch of useful but somewhat boring texts. And then I remember reading a blog post that was assigned to us by Elena on emotional intelligence, and it was short and crisp, and I just thought she understood people and she understood what was important about connecting with people. And so since then, I've been a fan of hers. I've taken a training through her institute before, and as I've read the first 4 chapters, there's so much that speaks to me that, of course, as an educator, it resonates, but I hope for people even who aren't working in the education space that there are a lot of practical tips on developing as a person and developing emotional resilience in particular.
I couldn't agree more. So much of this is about what it means to be human and our common humanity. Well, thank you for that. And last but not least, the kind of this community and network has brought new people into my life. One of those is the incredible Laurel Staab. So I'm excited, Laurel, for you to introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jackie, and very excited to be back on the panel this month discussing this excellent book that we've already started to get into, or people have started to broach a little bit in these intros. But my background, I have worked across different ages in education, from early childhood education to teaching in primary and then middle school as well. And currently I work as a faculty development kind of coach and trainer for African Leadership University, which has 2 locations, but I work out of the Kigali, Rwanda one remotely right now. That's why I'm in the US time zone. But and I'm very excited about discussing this book because I think that there's so many useful tools for those who work as educators, but also those who work with educators, just basically providing us with toolkits for ways that we can help support educators and also use these skills for ourselves, because it's very much about starting with the self, which I think we'll get into soon.
Yes. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Well, let's actually follow Laurel's advice and go to chapter 1, which was called Know Yourself. And again, for those who haven't read the book, we will share a lot with you as we go. So I'll start off. The first chapter says, when you know yourself well, when you understand your emotions, social identities, core values, and personality, you gain clarity. And she elaborates that being anchored in all of that can help you deal with setbacks even more. So my first question for the group is, how has your self-knowledge helped you at work Or in leadership, how has making self-knowledge and self-awareness helped kind of improve your working environment? So you can talk about it for yourself or as a leader who has helped others cultivate self-awareness.
Go ahead and go first.
Oh, well.
Oh, go ahead, Kendra.
Great, Kendra.
So I will give an example of how knowing oneself, it allows you to be able to be a clear-headed individual in situations that can definitely require you to take a step back and be reflective. I think about how this shows up when I coach teachers specifically, and how I'm able to extend these types of routines to my teachers, which happens, like, this is when the light bulb moment starts to happen with teachers. And that's what kind of motivates me to continue to coach as well, is that I love being able to inspire adults to have that light bulb moment about situations that may seem like they, are out of their control, or they don't have the tools to be able to diagnose. And it all starts with first me knowing where I can, as an individual, push and pull for folks to be able to get understanding and meaning out of their experiences. So one specific example, really quickly, I had a teacher who she was really struggling with understanding all of the different expectations that her administration was putting on her. She felt like she wasn't receiving any support. And the beginning of our coaching conversation sounded like a lot of lamenting, and that's typical, especially around this time of year. And through a series of questions, especially because I know myself and I was able to kind of pick up some trends in terms of what I had previously experienced as a teacher as well, I was able to get her to the point to understand that really she was just lacking some positive affirmation from some of her school leadership, and inspiring her to take a deeper look into what she actually needed, and then advocate for herself based on that perceived lack of support and lack of affirmation. So without me knowing and understanding how I, internalize those types of events, I was able to kind of push for her to take a deeper look into the things that she thought that she needed. And the light bulb went off, and it was an amazing experience. So yeah.
That is what we all live for as educators, as coaches, as leaders, that light bulb moment. So thank you so much for sharing that, Kendra. Rudy, I'd love to pass the baton to you.
Thanks, Jackie. Great feedback there, Kendra. And I think the piece that stood out to me for chapter 1 was regarding knowing yourself in terms of whether you might refer to yourself as an introvert or an extrovert. I think normally teachers having to basically perform in the classroom is one dynamic. And I think the current dynamic where so many teachers are teaching remotely on whatever video platform their district is using presents a new challenge, just in pointing out, as Elena did, knowing how you get your energy. So we talked at the top of the call about recharging and how you can get that energy back, but with folks having to be kind of scrutinized in a sense under the video camera's watchful eye, and knowing that now we even have, of course, parents being able to kind of peek over their shoulder and seeing what's going on with instruction brings a whole new set of dynamics into play. And so being able to kind of keep that in mind, and both for educators and then for folks who are coaching educators, to help them be able to recharge as needed, knowing themselves as far as what they need on that.
Self-knowledge, for me, it's knowing that I need to get outside. For example, if I'm too stuck in my head or too on Zoom, I need to close the laptop and get outside. One piece of this is about social identities. Laurel, we had been talking about dominant culture. I'm curious, how did that part of the chapter land on you?
Yeah, I was really glad and excited to see that Elena Aguilar included things on dominant culture in her chapter, because I do feel like going into this book, I had a little bit of trepidation. I hadn't actually read anything by her before, and sometimes I am nervous or anxious about more self-helpy texts, because I think that they don't always fully acknowledge like context and how context actually shapes a lot of our behaviors as individuals. And so was really excited to see that throughout the text, she's really strong in doing that. But the knowing yourself and dominant culture part resonated with me and made me think about, she talks about how within, different cultures, there's kind of these dominant cultures and these norms that everyone kind of accepts to be true, or to be real, that may or may not be, but how that can affect your perception of yourself, and how you should perform as an educator. So, and that really resonated with me. It reminded me of my first year of teaching, when I, multiple people told me, going to the classroom, like, oh, you're a woman, you're young, you're going to need to really like show them that you're the one in charge, and show them that you're the one who's in control, right? And so there was kind of like a gender component there. There's also kind of a cultural component, because it was a white person coming into a Latino community. And so people were giving me this advice. And multiple people told me you have to be really strict and you can't smile for the first 6 months. I don't know if anyone ever got told that when they were first a teacher, but hilarious that that's some of the advice that you get. But I think now I'm able to think back and unpack and be like, okay, so the dominant culture was actually one in which there was this ideology that we needed to be really strong in order to maintain control of the students. And now being able to unpack and be like, okay, that's not something that I want to be, or how I think it should go. But really interesting to see that play out, and that resonated with me when I heard her talk about that.
Thank you for sharing. I'm curious, does anybody else want to add about, since this is about knowing yourself, their identities in having to operate in where they might not be part of the dominant culture? Paula, please.
That's a huge question that I had to face when I came to the US. Interestingly enough, when I was in India, I felt that somehow I was able to blend in easily. But when I came to the US, there were so many stories about what it meant to be a Latina or a Hispanic, part of the Hispanic community. Stereotypes and I think preconceptions that I didn't grow up with. So a lot of people, let's say, that belong to my same community, felt that growing up they didn't have the same opportunities, or that they couldn't reach to a certain point because that was not the expectation that was for them. And growing up in Colombia, where everyone is Latino, I didn't have those expectations. I thought that anything could be possible. So when I came to the US, it really like made me think, what does it mean to be a Latina? What does it mean to be an immigrant? What does it mean to be a woman of color? And what is my responsibility as such? And something that I've practiced as an education consultant, not only with my clients on education, but also with my teams, is allowing everyone to tell their own story. Doesn't matter where you come from, but that exploration of what that means may be different, instead of just putting hats or stereotypes or preconceptions where they don't need to exist.
Thank you, Paula. And I'm curious, before we go on to the next chapter, does anybody have any tools that you'd recommend? Because know yourself is a big ask. And so, Paula, you made me think of, you're an education consultant. You've done Myers-Briggs. That's a personality assessment. I'm just curious, for unpacking your psyche, core values, purpose, any tools that anyone's recommended or that they've done before? And feel free, you can just raise your hand. I know it's class, it's silly, but Kendra, please jump in.
I have one that I used at the beginning of the school year with our new staff members, with the whole staff actually, for professional development, which is the good old compass points directions survey, where folks basically select a series of statements, and it gives you a specific compass point on a compass. So like if you're north, those are typically people who are like action oriented. If you're south, you're usually really led by your emotions and feelings. And then east and west, I always confuse. One is more process based and the other is more big picture based. But it's really interesting because people find over time, if you take those different surveys in different spaces or under different circumstances, you could get different results. And so what most people find is like they're not just one compass point direction. And it's a great way to build community amongst staff members, and also for you to look introspectively and think about who you are and how you show up, and to also convene with people who are like you, and then learn how to connect with those who aren't like you. So it is one tool that I've used. I've also did the MBTI, the Myers-Briggs, which I am also an INFJ, just like Elena Aguilar, let me just say. So, kindred spirit.
Awesome. And Kendra, in the YouTube chat, if you wouldn't mind just typing the name of that tool, the compass that you mentioned, that would be a helpful resource. Does anybody else want to share? Rudy, please.
Yeah, I've got one that I really like. Johns Hopkins is really known for its neuroscience, and one aspect of that we've discussed that really resonated with me is around what a subcategory, which is neuroleadership. And so it's the SCARF model. It's an acronym, and I'll drop that in the chat as well. And so the acronym for the word SCARF is status, certainty, autonomy, relationships, and fairness. And so these are different areas. It's almost like the love languages, but for leadership. And so it's what are different areas where you may feel some social insecurities. And so it kind of compels you to reflect on your own, like I said, insecurities and those of others, to think about how might they be reacting. They might be reacting in response to feeling insecure about one or more of those areas. And there's an online assessment that I'll drop in the chat right now as well for people to use if they want.
Yay, free resources. Again, we want this discussion to be both inspirational and directly applicable to our daily lives. So it's fun to get tools we could try out tomorrow at work, whatever that means in a pandemic to you. Before we move on, is there any other kind of best practices that anyone wants to share? Okay, Laurel, please.
Sure. Well, I had a tool that we've used for actually like leadership training and development that I found very helpful, because in the chapter she talks about knowing your values and how those actually shape a lot of how you interact with the world, but also if you're in dissonance with your values, that can be very high risk. But it's also can be helpful to know your values, to know what other people's values are and relate to each other. And so we've done an activity at my place of work where we're given kind of just like 30 cards that have different values on them. And they're just run the kind of generic ones, and there's also ones where you can write in your own. But the activity or the power of it is actually that you have to go through all 30 and you have to eliminate ones that you think are not yours, and you choose kind of first your top 10, and then you'll go down to your top 5 and then your top 3. And I found that exercise was actually much more meaningful and helpful for me than just when someone says like, oh, what are your top values? And you have to choose them from everything, because that process of elimination where you really have to discern like, which is the one that I find more important, and like this one is kind of important to me, but it actually kind of falls under this one. That exercise has been really meaningful for me. And then I kept a list of what every single person in the workshop had as their values as well. And I still go back and refer to that with my coworkers to be like, oh, I remember this about this person, and this is what's driving them here. It just helps to really understand people better.
I'm sure that helps make people feel seen, that you remember something they said.
Or scared. Because it's like, I think it's like 3 years ago now, and I'm like, oh, but I remember this about you, your value of excellence. Mm-hmm.
Well, we're halfway in, and of course, it's time to move on to the second chapter. There's a few more that we'd like to discuss. So the second chapter is very foundational. She says, after know yourself, this is where you need to begin. Whereas in later chapters, she's like, these topics could be done in any month, in any order. But understanding emotions is crucial. And she starts this chapter, it's on page 45, with understanding emotions, both accepting them and having strategies to respond to them, is essential to cultivating resilience. And so key words there are the acceptance, the recognition, which is where can you influence a situation, and how can you let go of what is outside of your control, locus of control. She then goes on to describe emotions as a series of events. And there's this great flow chart on page 48 that's about the cycle of an emotion. Zachariah, we had talked a little bit about this. I know it resonated with you. I'm curious if you could just kind of walk people who haven't read the book through it, and then share what you like about this model or this framework, how it has helped you.
Sure. What resonated with me about this framework is that, and I will just speak from my perspective on this, it took something that I usually conflate all of these things into a single thing. And so when I try to reflect on having an emotional experience or having a conflict, I'm often not sure where to start, where to pick it apart. And I thought that the way she laid it out based on the research she did was so simple. And the first thing is that it starts with a prompting event. And that prompting event is something outside of yourself. So I actually already like that there was a separation from the event, between the event and the self, because it puts you it puts me in the mode of an examiner. And then right after the prompting event is our interpretation of it. And that resonated with me because I often feel that it is my interpretation of events. And Elena goes on to talk about, the stories that we tell ourselves, but it is my interpretation of events that is just that. It is something adjacent to, I think is related often, but not always, but is adjacent to that initial event. So one could interpret that initial event in a number of ways. But when I choose to interpret it in a certain way, particularly a self-critical way, that then sends me down a fairly predetermined path. But if I pause at that event and think to myself, what are some possible interpretations? And I think what she's saying is like, this doesn't necessarily come naturally. Like it takes practice, it takes gradual building of awareness. But if you then choose to interpret it in a number of different ways, from a number of different perspectives, including from the perspective of that person, that then can lead to a different thing. So after the prompting event and the interpretation, she says that there is a physical reaction in the body. So for folks who are not used to sort of connecting with their body and realizing the emotional physical connection that is within the body, that can be a really great opportunity to do a body scan, recognize where you might be feeling that emotion. If it's anger, if it's worry, if it's grief, where actually in your body is that coming from? And people can pinpoint that. And again, building awareness over how you react to things, but then also realizing that there's a great synergy between the physical and the emotional in our lives. So when you feel that that emotion, when you feel the emotion physically, you then feel the urge to act, and then there's the act itself, and then there's whatever emotional after effects come from the action. And that could potentially, that last piece, the emotional after effects, could potentially send you into another spiral. And so for me, I found this also compelling, because if I just go back to those first two things, the initial event and then my interpretation of it, that can save me a lot of trouble from having to go down these other steps if it's not really worthwhile, or if it's not really appropriate, or if my interpretation of what happened was too self-centered or too self-critical. So that stood out to me, because I thought you could just track it really easily. And if you're looking to intervene with yourself, or if you are coaching with someone and you're helping them pinpoint certain areas where they may have trouble, if there's a recurring pattern, you can use this as a helpful framework to either within yourself or with someone else, recognize trigger points for you, and come prepared with strategies that you may be able to use in the moment, whether it's something as simple as taking 3 deep breaths, whether it is maybe writing that angry email, but then never actually sending it, coming prepared so that when you're in the moment, you're not so caught off guard.
Knowing triggers does seem like a perfect blend of chapters 1 and 2, which is like know yourself and understand yourself, aka the emotions that you very often have and what those triggers are. Thank you, Zachariah, for walking us through that. Kendra, you also told me that this cycle of an emotion framework resonated with you. You coach educators every day. I'm curious if you wanted to elaborate.
Yeah, I love to have the visual for the very reason that Zachariah just named, that you can use it as a framework in coaching. And specifically, I love the example that they shared in the text that is around a fire drill, a surprise fire drill that happens, and just cycling through all of the different points of that framework that a teacher, all the emotions that a teacher has when something like an event that seems semi-harmless and honestly probably for the greater good of the school, but how that could impact the teacher who's already overwhelmed and has the different assumptions and interpretations of what is actually happening. And so it made me think honestly back, not just the time when I was coaching, but when I was a teacher way back in the 2009 era, Jackie. Can you believe that on the very first few iterations of Facebook, I guess it probably had to be like Facebook 2.0 maybe, I had a student who created a fake Facebook profile of me. This was before the Catfish TV show, by the way. And I can pinpoint how upset I was, and literally, I was probably like boiling in terms of anger and upset. And I made stories up about what that student was trying to do and achieve with creating the Facebook page. When in reality, you know, if I look at the actual after effects of the event, there wasn't anything vicious stated on the page, but it literally was just the actual act itself that made me spiral through this cycle and have these stories that I told myself about what that student was trying to accomplish. Still not the best choice for a student to do for their new teacher, but I definitely had to come to grips with like what actually happened and what could reasonably what consequence could reasonably be enacted on that student. Because I definitely was like, we got to take this to the courts, I think. But really, that was me making these really strong interpretations about what, you know, the experience was. Then I had another one when a student hit my parked car, brand new, that I bought. But we won't go down that rabbit hole.
Oh boy. I feel like we all have stories of times when we've interpreted things perhaps more negatively or more personally than they might have been intended. I'm curious, anyone else just want to share their reaction, whether personally or how it's shown up in their own coaching or work? Paula, I know you chose this exercise for onboarding new coaches to your organization this week, so I'm going to spotlight you.
Yeah, of course. I think the reason why I chose it, Jackie, and what I think is so important is because I guess through my work, and particularly this year, when I was engaging in conversations and when we were engaging in conversations with teachers just to understand the reality, there were a lot of emotions and there were a lot of fears and a lot of anxiety. And I think it's important, something that Elena Aguilar says, and I think is really important, and this is a really good tool, is leaning into the emotion, not avoiding it, but honor the feelings in that moment and taking the time to explore them, right? So the same way that we take the time to explore how we are feeling, given the space to that other person to unpack what is going on and what is the story that they are telling themselves. So experience that we had with Kendra, I think in one of our training exercises was about that, like how do you react when someone on the other side that you're coaching starts crying or has a lot of anxiety or has a physical reaction that is very strong? And I really loved Elena's idea of with empathy and curiosity, how can you both enter that journey of exploration? So that's why I chose it. And the other thing that I was thinking today and rereading the chapter, Elena mentions that most of the emotions, particularly those that are anger or sadness, really concentrate in our chest, in our throat. And that was happening to me today. And just going back to the framework and how Zachariah explained it, it's really helpful to understand where the pain is and what the emotion is triggering. An exercise that I did today was just like trying to expand the anxiety from the chest into my whole body. It wasn't less heavy. So I just wanted to share that technique because it was really helpful, and it reminded me of the techniques that Elena was sharing with us.
Paula, you shared a technique with me on a body scan about focusing on my feet because that's where we're most grounded. And often today I've just been like wiggling my toes to feel like connected to my feet and more grounded. But I know I carry it a lot personally in my shoulders. And so trying to like get up and stretch makes me feel a little more free and in control. Well, thank you all. Again, there's a way more we could talk to and dive into in chapter 2, but we should move on to chapter 3, which is about a favorite topic of mine, storytelling. It's called specifically Tell Empowering Stories. And I love Elena's work because she tells specific stories from her own coaching or from her own days as a teacher. But she also, I as someone who loves structure, she gives us all these like frameworks. And so there's a figure on 3.1, which breaks down different elements of empowered storytelling. And I should have used a visual for the cycle of emotion. But 1, be aware of your thoughts. 2, recognize and shift distorted thoughts. And when I read the distorted thoughts and then turned the page, and starting on page 72, she actually it's not on 72. It's on she breaks down common patterns. Thank you, of distorted thinking on 76. And I was like, yes, my structured brain, like, give me the framework and give me the example. It's like really helpful for me. So there's a lot in this, which is first kind of the rooting, the uprooting these problematic, thoughts or beliefs. And then she tries to give us advice for how to craft new stories, recognize organizational narratives, and share your story. So I'm just curious, does anybody want to talk and unpack a little bit of this chapter and what resonated with you?
Sure, I can a little bit. I have a very meta one that I can do, actually. So it's not about education so much as my own reading of this book, because I mentioned in the beginning that I was a little skeptical about coming to this book and the focus on maybe like only focusing on the individual and not necessarily having the context. And so I do have a tendency to be critical and to think critically, which I think can be a strength, but can also be a weakness of overgeneralization, right? Or overgeneralizing, which is one of these distorted thoughts, right? But she also talked about, I think it was in this chapter, about the power of core beliefs. And some of these can be distorted and not. But I also try to have a core belief for myself, which is that I can learn something from everything or anything. And so even if I have an initial kind of that critical reaction to something, if I hear about it, trying to lean into it anyways and gain or make it into a learning experience for myself and be like, it doesn't matter what, I'm going to go into this, I'm going to delve into it. And so glad I did, because I think that there's so much in this text that is incredibly useful and helpful for all of us, like we're saying, as educators, but also as people. So I wanted to throw that meta thing that I noticed about myself out there.
Thank you. I love it. And I don't know if everyone can see, but other panelists are snapping in response. Anybody have a story of a time when you were able to interrupt a negative story? And maybe, I think that's the hardest thing, because like I immediately think I'm right. I react emotionally and in my body. And it's hard. I need somebody objective to help me reframe. That's why I so believe in coaching, because I find it hard to do by myself, to reframe. And so I'm just curious, does anybody have an example whether someone helped you reframe a negative story or a distorted belief, or that you helped somebody else to reframe?
Well, I have a simple, when I find myself doing that, I have a simple phrase in my head that kind of is like, well, who made you the expert? Like, I question myself, because that humble moment helps me to kind of get back to, the reality of what other stories could be. And then I think my 5 years of experience of living in a Middle Eastern country where many stories were told to me before I got on the plane about, are you safe? Are you sure? Do you really is there a job there? Do you know? I think that every experience or every moment that I was there was the opportunity for me to reframe and create my own narrative and story around what that experience would be like and what I wanted to own of that story. So I think, again, something very simple. Sometimes it's more like, who made you the queen? Like, I think a little colloquialism, because, I think that it can get hard for coaches. I'll speak using I statements. Coaching is a very individualistic job, especially if you're in a school setting where there's just one coach. So I am one coach at my school, and it's hard for me to find that community, which I won't, delve too deep into, because that's another part of our lovely book. But it is easy to tell yourself one side of the story, and getting back to that point where you realize, like, you are not the only person. I don't know if anybody's familiar with The Danger of a Single Story by Chimamanda Adichie. Way back in the day, TED Talk, but it's dangerous to have one side of the story, or have one story and not be open to what could be. So
amazing. Thank you so much. Paula and I interviewed a professional coach and a professor of mine from graduate school, and she said, if nothing else, I want my coachees to be able to expand their options, expand your options of how you interpret things, expand your options of how you act on them. And I love that idea that there isn't just one story. So, and thanks for that book recommendation, Kendra. Definitely share it in the YouTube chat. Anybody else? Is there a negative story in your head that you're working on currently? Or Rudy, great. That question or something earlier.
Thanks. Yeah, I think what came to mind kind of goes back to what Laurel was saying earlier, just around thinking about the balance of individual resilience, but then also a couple of the bigger factors that Elena acknowledges in terms of the framework around the fact that there are systemic issues that also need to be addressed to support resilience. And so one piece that connects to this conversation is the destructive organizational narratives. And so I think the common setting that is discussed around that, which is a reality, is in a lot of places the teacher's lounge, where a lot of negativity can kind of cycle through, and a lot of negative organizational narratives can be shared and passed on, which can be very discouraging, particularly for newer educators. And I think for myself, coming into, like I said, a school system where I was a student myself for a number of years, and was able to, be a first generation college student at Stanford University. I felt like I was able to counter the narrative that a lot of the staff had about the potential of our students. And so growing up, just a couple miles away from the high school that I served at, I was able to kind of disprove and give them a counterexample that about the expectations, the low expectations that they had for the students in the school. And so I think that that is really critical to kind of interrupt those narratives, both in terms of yourself as an educator, or if you're in a leadership position, particularly in that leadership role as well.
Thank you so much, Rudy. And I just, again, want to shout out everybody on the chat. Judy Bello, thank you so much for forming connections with what we're saying to ways that you have taught with different pieces of literature, including Genesis and the Gospel of Mark, to the Japanese film Rashomon. We love our loyal participants, not just listeners, but participants who are joining in the conversation with us. So thank you for that. As you can see at the bottom, Kendra shared her recommendation of Chimamanda Adichie's TED Talk, as well as, is there a book as well, Kendra, tied to this, or a short piece of writing?
There's an article, actually.
Yeah, I think it's a short story. Well, okay.
Yeah,
Laurel.
I can find it. We teach it, actually, so I can find it.
Great. Awesome. So we're in our last 10 minutes, so it's a perfect time to transition to a very meaty chapter that a lot of us care about as leaders within our organizations or our spaces, and that's build community. This chapter is broken up into a number of sections. One about the importance of trust. I think she mentions how relational teaching is with students, with other adults, with parents. So the important need for the relational trust among adults and how it impacts student learning. She also then goes into communication and listening skills, as well as issues of cultural competence. So there's a lot in this chapter to react to. I want to open the floor to anybody to start about how this chapter or made you think about your own practice. I am curious about kind of positive and negative examples that you've experienced with regards to toxic cultures at work, as well as cultures and communities that have really helped others thrive. So does anyone want to start in this chapter about how you think about building community? Yes, Zachariah.
Jump in. Yeah, so having just finished 4 years in administration, one of the things that stands out to me is in some ways how different the process of community building is among adults as opposed to among kids. There's just a different atmosphere there in the classroom, particularly if you're a homeroom teacher and you're with those kids almost all day for the whole year. And adults have some similar needs, but I found in my experience that needs and intentions can be veiled, whereas kids, particularly young kids, simply wear their emotions on their sleeve, and you know exactly what you're getting at. So through the past few years, I've built up some practices that I think are pretty good, both on the one-on-one level for building community and a more systemic approach through schools. So if I'm new in an environment, anyone that I'm working alongside, particularly folks who I'll be supervising, I'll send out a note in the summer before the school year begins, and that's my listening tour. And I just invite people. It's not mandatory, but invite people to come get to know me. I'm sure they're curious about me, and I also want to get to know them. And I let conversation flow organically. I have a set of questions that I put out from the start that we can use as a sample, but oftentimes once you get to know people, you just the conversation takes its own way, and you cover a lot of different topics with different people. One person stopped in for 5 minutes, and I could tell it was a pretty perfunctory thing from her end, which was fine. And a couple of people stopped in for a couple of hours. And we just talked, and I intentionally left things open-ended. I didn't have a lot of things on my schedule, and from the get-go, and I heard feedback from people as well. But I also felt that from the get-go, that was the right foot to start on with people, because yes, we are professionals, but you bring your personhood to work. We naturally do that. I think it's actually harder and more intentional to have to put up boundaries, which I also think are a good thing, but we always bring our full personhood to work. And that's something that I've grown into and grown to embrace actually through the years. Whereas I used to just want to keep all those things separate, I realized that there are some benefits from getting together with people and just letting them know that you're a real person too. One more idea that I'll mention, we did this a couple of years ago at my last school, is this idea of community cohorts. And at the beginning of the year, we started with a session that we repeated, I think, 3 or 4 times throughout the year during our faculty meetings. The principal at the time said that one of her main objectives was building or rebuilding community among the faculty. And so at the beginning of the year, we asked people to self-sort into one of 4 different categories to focus on community through different lenses. It could be community through the lens of students, of families, of faculty or colleagues, or the big picture, however people interpret big picture. And through that session and subsequent sessions, people identified areas that they thought we were doing really well in regards to community in those areas, and areas that we thought we could improve. And we took the improve list, and we turned those groups then turned that into one tangible project that they could actually enact. We had a small budget if needed, but it was all fairly low cost. When your emphasis and your energy goes toward community, sometimes it really doesn't take that much money at all. And so one highlight for us that came from the group that focused on community among colleagues was that at that time we had the Chinese New Year coming up, and our Mandarin teacher, who was born and raised in China, wanted to cook for everyone, and one other person from that group wanted to host. And so we had an impromptu faculty party for the Chinese New Year, expressly meant to build community, but also an idea derived from the intention of building community as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Zachariah. Gosh, you gave us so much to go off of. 1, creating space for others. 2, you mentioned creative self-expression. I think, people can foster climates and build community where you feel like you can be your full self. And I just love that you always bring practical strategies to these conversations. So thank you so much for doing that. Anybody else? Any part of this chapter that you want to talk to with regards to your experience building community? Paula.
Doing some reactions to Zachariah. As you were talking, I was like trying to connect the things that I saw in that chapter, and vulnerability came to my mind as opposed to fear. And fear is something that Elena talks a lot in that chapter about, like, how do we show ourselves to others, and what do we think that they're gonna believe of ourselves. So with the example that you just shared with us, Zachariah, I kept thinking of like the courage to just bring my whole self to that community. And I'm like connecting the dots with chapter 3, which was the storytelling, and how by being vulnerable and being courageous enough to face those fears, and sharing my story, also asking others to share theirs. And community, I feel that we really build community when we create this collective vision or this collective story. So just having, being vulnerable enough to share who we are and bring ourselves to the work or to whatever we're doing, and allowing others to do the same, builds that story that creates a community at the end of the day. So the word for me after you talk, Sakara, is really vulnerability and the importance of it.
Thank you, Paula. When I was in grad school, we had a program called Talk, where on Monday nights, 2 classmates would share their life story, whatever they wanted to talk about, usually the not work side of it, the hard stuff. And that space gave me a place to share about how hard it was when my dad died. I got in trouble in college, like stories like that maybe I felt shame about and wanted to hide or compartmentalize. And communities that have really felt like that I could open up and share, I've just felt a greater part of. And I've tried to take some piece of Talk, this program, to every work environment I've been in. And so most recently at a company called Wonder School, I started something at All Hands where we'd share a Wondergram, which is like an Instagram version of our life, but not the shiny stuff, but just at All Hands, share photos from who you are outside of work. And Paula, in our Edwell Slack channel, we have a hashtag Life Outside Work channel so that we know it isn't all about work, but our full selves. Any last comments about building community before we end with a quote from the book? Great. I know time management. I'm sorry, everybody, for getting us started a bit late with the YouTube glitch. As an English teacher, I love text-based analysis. I try to draw to a book. And so when I'm reading a book, I'm always highlighting the quotes. I know my mom does the same thing. She emailed out all our neighbors her favorite quotes from this book today that has helped her cope with what's going on. But I'm curious if a panelist just wants to share a favorite quote from the section that we read and why it resonates with them, just to end today. Rudy, thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. Yeah, I think especially in the current environment, it can be more challenging doing this, virtually through, again, whichever video platform you're kind of stuck with. But all the more important to develop community and be proactive and mindful of that on an ongoing basis. And so I felt like one of the last couple of pages, page 98, had a really strong quote that stood out to me on that front. And it states that you cannot thrive unless you're in healthy relationships. And we all know that relationships take work. And so it's good, I think, for all of us to keep that in mind from whatever position we're in working with educators and supporting educators.
Thank you so much, Rudy. As Judy Bello says in the chat, this is a fabulous synergistic community. That means you can join us for the second section of the book next week at this same time, 5:30 Pacific, 8:30 p.m. Eastern. We will be tackling the next 4 chapters of the book, which I am scrambling to quickly pull up there, about being present, about taking care of yourself, about focusing on the bright spots, and about cultivating compassion. So big topics for all of us. I want to thank this incredible panel. Thank you all so much for being here. And we'll see you all next